Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this new session of the Book Talk series of the Religion and International Relations section of the ISA. My name is Jocelyne Cesari. I am the chair of the section Religion and IR, and in this capacity, I am also convening this session and the previous one. We are now on our 9th edition of the Book Talk series, and it's a great pleasure to introduce the new book of David Buckley called Blessing America First, Religion, Populism, and Foreign Policy in the Trump Administration, just published by Columbia University Press. And today's discussion really promised to be not only insightful and thought-provoking, but also very timely. This is a crucial moment in American political history with the re-election of Donald Trump as president. And as we know, the first Trump administration was nothing short of transformative. It reshaped the interplay between religion and foreign policy in profound ways. And this legacy may be revisited, if not transformed, in the upcoming months. So today's discussion will help us unpack this complex dynamic between religion, institution, and foreign policy. So I will give the floor first to David Buckley as the author of the book. David Buckley is the Paul Weber Endowed Chair of Politics, Science, and Religion at the University of Louisville. Then we will be joined by Dr. Gregorio Betizza, Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of Exeter, that will provide remarks on the book. And we had initially invited Dr. Christina Stöckel, but she unfortunately had to decline for health issue. So I will say a few words coming from her, and I will add my own comment to the book, and then we will have the Q&A with the audience. First, I would like to remind you that the session is recorded and that you will get the link of the recording in a few days after the session is over, and that you can interact with us in two ways. You can write your question in the Q&A, or at the end of the presentation, you can also raise your hand and I will give you the floor. So with no further ado, I give the floor to David for 10 minutes. David, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jocelyn, for asking me to do this. This is fun to get to do as we wrap up our academic semester here in the States. And thanks again to Gregorio for taking the time to join us and discuss the book. Very generous at a busy time in the semester, I know. And also to Christina for sending her thoughts. It's a shame that she's fallen ill and can't be here right now, but very glad for her thoughts too. So what I want to do in a short period of time is give an overall overview of the book and then a few highlights from the analysis. Obviously, we can't sort of give too many details in a shorter time frame like this, but hoping to give a taste of the different parts of the book and some of the empirical analysis that goes into it. One thing that I do want to be clear on about this book, it is partially drawn on personal experience, my sort of accidental work as an academic fellow in 2016, 2017, in the first 6 months of the Trump administration at the State Department. But it's not primarily a memoir, right? I try to draw on personal experiences, but also kind of leverage my own training as a comparativist with an interest in religion and democracy to try to make sense out of the changes that I saw firsthand, and then also to broaden the scope to the rest of the Trump administration's first term as well. So to briefly summarize the argument, we could turn to a couple of acts. Act one, making religion and diplomacy boring, right? This is a handbook from the office that I worked in, the Office of Religion and Global Affairs at the State Department, from the second half of 2016. At that point in time, the office had about 30 staff members in it, and their job was to assess religion's influence on U.S. foreign policy interests and advise diplomats on potential engagement responses, right? This was relatively routinized work at that point in time. It involved work through the regional bureaus of the State Department, as well as sort of more specialized functional areas, including environmental diplomacy and even sometimes surprising work like anti-corruption work. Right? The book starts out with a little bit of a summary of how that office was working during that period. But then it shifts pretty quickly to this. Right? This may be a picture that's familiar to some of you anyway. The glowing orb of diplomacy here. This was a picture from actually then President Trump's first trip abroad. And I choose this picture to start out today because I think it actually gets across the shift that I observed during this transition from the Obama to Trump administrations, away from religion as being a relatively kind of rationalized part of bureaucratic process, and towards a much more, what I argue is populist-inflected form of religious diplomacy. In the book, I try to argue that populism had two primary effects on religion within the bureaucracy, tied to the nature of populism itself, not just conservative politics, right? That this isn't just about partisanship, but something about populism itself that changes the way that the bureaucracy functions. On the one hand, there is a kind of what scholars of populism call thin ideological part of this story, right? The construction of in-groups and out-groups. Religion and foreign policy became a part of that, for sure. But there's also a personalism involved in populist politics, right? A rejection of bureaucratic constraint, and a theatricality of style, right? We see the style in the picture here. But the bypassing of bureaucratic expertise also shows through here, because this image, as I said, comes from President Trump's first international visit, right? A visit that related to very much religion and U.S. diplomacy in the first half of 2017. The Office of Religion and Global Affairs essentially had no input into the sort of substance or strategy of that visit, right? It was entirely bypassed in favor of the kind of personal priorities of the White House and kind of key personal loyalists around the president. And so both on substance, the kind of thin ideology of the foreign policy that the Trump administration pursued, and the process, right, the personalist process, this picture is helpful, I think, in understanding what I try to do in the book. I will just give a brief overview of kind of the overall flow of the argument, and then show a couple of pieces of evidence and turn things over for responses, and then happy to have conversation. So again, at a basic level, the book sets out to ask how the bureaucratization of religion in the foreign policy apparatus changed during the Trump administration, and what explains that change. And the first claim, and this is essentially the first half of the book, is that the short-term source of that change rested on the populist nature of the Trump administration, right? And that two particular dimensions of populism had effects. First of all, populism is a thin ideology. This is the scholarship from Moody and Kaltwasser and others, right, who have documented the role of religion at times in contributing to that thin ideology around populism. But also populism, and I think this is newer to the religion and politics literature, or I hope it is anyway, the part of populism that rests on personal governance and a rejection of institutional constraint or institutional expertise. I think that this was in some ways maybe actually the most significant change to the way that religion factored into U.S. foreign policy. Not so much focusing on the substance, but the process, right, of religion in the bureaucracy, and one that I try to spotlight in the book. The second half of the book then shifts to asking about sort of why this populist change was so significant, right? And I try to spotlight three pre-existing conditions of American religion and American politics and the U.S. foreign policy bureaucracy that contributed to this. So each one of these is a chapter in the second half of the book. A chapter on bureaucratic culture, the way in which I think that the culture of nonpartisan civil service led to certain forms of response to populism, but also kind of limited constraints, actually. A chapter on institutional flexibility, particularly related to constitutional law. Some scholars have argued that the United States has advantages when it comes to the stability of our democracy compared to other countries affected by populism because of the stability of our institutions or the rigidity of our institutions. I think actually when it comes to religion and politics, that's not true at all. I think our institutions are quite flexible legally, right? And we saw that in the Supreme Court's eventual support for Trump administration policies related to religion and foreign policy. And then finally, there's a chapter on public opinion and how our kind of public polarization over religion and politics fed into this. One thing that hopefully is standing out already is that this is largely a domestic politics explanation for the shape of religion in U.S. foreign policy. Again, this is not to say that there aren't interesting IR questions here. And I mean, Gregorio has asked some of those questions and made really important progress there. But both my kind of background as a comparativist and also what I observed firsthand in terms of the domestic sources of some of these changes is what leads me to essentially a domestic politics, comparative politics kind of analysis of changes in the bureaucracy. Okay, so in just a few minutes then, let me jump forward because I want to leave plenty of time for conversation. But let me jump forward to telling you a bit about some of the empirics in the book. What I'm actually not going to talk too much about for right now is the thin ideological part of populism. I actually think this has been relatively well covered in some important literature, including from Jeffrey Haynes and others, and the Nadia Marzuki volume on religion and populism in Western Europe. That religion can contribute in some ways to the thin ideology behind populism. I think we certainly have seen this in many places globally, including in Brazil under Bolsonaro, and we saw it. Sorry, that was supposed to happen second. And we saw it in the US in terms of religion and foreign policy with the Muslim bans. I think this is the most obvious indicator of that. And that's part of the book, and I'm happy to talk more about that. Religion was a part of the way in which the Trump administration both excluded certain groups, right, from the body politic and also constructed in-group identity. I think that's certainly true. The second part that I'll talk a little bit more about for a minute here is this personalism, this dimension of populism tied to the structure of governance and the process of governance, right? We've seen this internationally through undermining of the rule of law in favor of personal grievances, right, against potential critics of populist rule. And I think that we saw this in the foreign policy bureaucracy during this time period. In the book, in the chapter on personalism and its effects, I try to distinguish the way in which personalist governance led to different responses to different aspects of the bureaucracy. Gregorio's research, for instance, has been very helpful in showing the different offices that developed related to religion in the bureaucracy before, right, the Trump administration. Personalism's response to the bureaucracy depended on the nature, right, of the bureaucracy, the bureaucratic office in question, and its relationship to the populist project, right? So in some cases, for instance, the office that I worked in, this is a picture of the hallway outside of the Office of Religion and Global Affairs during the transition. There was no direct confrontation for the most part, actually. There was simply neglect or bypassing, right? There was no real attempt or capacity from this office to constrain any of the populist administration's goals, right? And for that reason, there wasn't any need to sort of dramatically reassign anyone or eliminate offices. Instead, the office was allowed to wither, more or less, right? Its staffing capacity decreased from approximately 30 in the summer of 2016 to, I believe, a half dozen by the time I left in summer of 2017. The office was never formally eliminated, but it was demoted within the organizational chart, subsumed within international religious freedom, and deprived of a political appointee as its leadership, right? So this populist personalism led to essentially bypassing this kind of an office. In other instances, there was much more direct confrontation. Probably the most dramatic example of this related to religion is the confrontations related to funding for houses of worship related to post-ISIS reconstruction in Iraq. In this case, there were offices, particularly in USAID, who attempted to put some constraints on administration prerogatives, right, or administration plans to fund churches. And in this instance, there was real pushback from the administration, right? career civil servants were transferred out of their roles, new political appointees were put in place, and the policy was pushed through in the end, right? So in that case, the bureaucracy was much more actively confronted. Throughout, though, and this is another piece of the personalist story, what happens is that the formal offices that Gregorio has charted in his research over the course of really 20 years, that grew up over the course of 20 years, fade in importance compared to personal ties to administration officials, right? There are some great quotes that were on the record and publicly given by Trump loyalists within religious circles that essentially it was less important to have bureaucratic offices than it was to have meetings at the White House and State Department that began or ended with prayer, right? This kind of personal side to the administration's approach. There's a wonderful quote, and I'll start to wrap up with this, in a press conference from Sarah Huckabee Sanders about midway through the term, where Sanders was actually asked, she was White House press secretary at that point in time, and she was asked, why hasn't the administration staffed some of these bureaucratic offices, right? Including at the State Department, but also within the White House. And her response was this, quote, "Look, I don't think an office is what determines the faith of the administration. I think we probably have actually more people front and center speaking openly about their faith." Right? And I think that quote really gets across nicely the turn away from kind of bureaucratized expertise that had emerged over the course of relatively bipartisan manner over the course of 20 years to this much more kind of personalistic approach to religion and its relationship to foreign policy. So that's the story when it comes to the changes that happened, I think, and how they were tied to Trump's populism during that period. You know, I think in the interest of time, I won't talk in much depth about the precondition side of the argument, but maybe one thing that I'll highlight is some of the bureaucratic culture and how it fit into this. I think that it is not quite right to say that, in my experience, that sort of religion and the bureaucracy in general became a kind of hotbed of deep state conspiracy against the administration's prerogatives. Actually, I think that the culture of nonpartisan civil service is deeply embedded within the U.S. foreign policy bureaucracy, and for that reason, what I try to chart out is paths of response to populism from within the bureaucracy that took on different shapes, but rarely resembled kind of deep state conspiracy against the administration, right? And in fact, when resistance happened, or when there were sort of deeply seated objections to policy, as might come up in, if I get the pointer working here, yeah, as might come up on this side of the spectrum, for instance, we saw civil servants leaving, right, or foreign service officers leaving the bureaucracy entirely, exiting, or when they engaged in constraint, doing so in bureaucratized manners, right? For instance, the submission of a dissent channel cable in response to the initial Muslim ban, right? This was a dissent, right? It was actually a substantive step taken by over 1,000 State Department staffers to object to the policy approach. But it was one that was done entirely within the appropriate channels, right, within the bureaucratized channels of dissent, and for that reason was really of no concern, I don't think, to the Trump administration. In fact, Sean Spicer gave a press conference in response to this dissent channel where he clearly welcomed this dissent and said that officials either needed to get on board or get out of government, right? So the book then moves from the bureaucratic culture to the legal frameworks and to public opinion, to show that a lot of these conditions that got us into this situation actually were pre-existing, right, and haven't gone away. So I'll more or less wrap up there. I think I'm pretty much on 15 minutes. There's a part of the book also that looks at the international ties, right, that were encouraged by the populism, the religious populism of the Trump administration. We saw, for instance, Russian Orthodox Church officials meeting with Vice President Pence very early in the Trump administration. And some of these have outlived the administration, obviously, and I would expect them to become relevant again. So I'll wrap up there and let the conversation start. Happy to talk more about other elements of the book as we go through the comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I'm going to give the floor now to Gregorio Betizza. Please, Gregorio, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. David and Jocelyn for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I prepared some remarks, so I'll sort of go through them to be sure that I touch all the key points. But let me begin my comments by emphasizing really some of the book's strengths. First and foremost, I believe this is a gem of a book, particularly because it combines a unique set of original theoretical insights, more of which I will discuss in a moment, with extensive empirical research based also on David's first-person account of working in the State Department's Office of Religion and Global Affairs during a critical historical juncture for the office itself, as well as the US political system more widely, and the effective use and mixing of multiple methods: ethnographic participant observation, of course, we saw the photo, process tracing, surveys, among others. It is theoretically sophisticated, empirically nuanced, and methodologically rigorous. The book seeks to explain the effects that the Trump administration had on US foreign policy, especially in relation to religion and its progressive operationalization in American statecraft, or what David calls bureaucratization, in American statecraft and diplomacy across a number of previous administrations and dimensions. David's book detects a profound change taking place under Trump, compared to what he argues was this bipartisan consensus which seemed to animate the project of operationalizing religion in US foreign policy in previous decades. The monograph locates the source of radical change in populism, which would shape the substance of Trump's religious foreign policy and process, as we heard now, on how the administration would pursue its goals. Under Trump, we learned there was an especially pronounced attention to international religious freedom, to reinforcing certain forms of Christian and Judeo-Christian identitarianism, especially against a Muslim other, and the degrading of the religious engagement agenda and institutional infrastructure in the State Department, where David himself was sitting. Second, David's book, Blessing America First, is an excellent and thoughtful sequence, if you allow me to be self-referential, and David a number of times mentioned my previous book, Finding Faith in Foreign Policy. It is, of course, a huge pleasure to see colleagues engaging thoroughly with one's own scholarship, as David does, when he explores the changes under Trump and populism to what I have called the regime complex on religion and US foreign policy, which connects faith-based aid, particularly centered at USAID, international religious freedom, public diplomacy and countering violent extremism activities targeting Muslims, and religious engagement. I also believe that Blessing America First moves forward research in this area, not just empirically by considering the Trump and partly Biden administration, which my own book does not really address, but also conceptually and empirically. My account and explanation of the operationalization of religion in US foreign policy focused mostly on two factors. One were macro-level developments, namely processes of global religious resurgence occurring within the US, but also beyond it during the past decades, which I then connected with certain developments at the micro level, represented especially by the mobilization of particular actors, faith-based activists, organizations, policy experts, scholars, as well as political figures who sought to desecularize, as I put it, American foreign policy institutions, norms, and practices in what has been also labeled an increasingly post-secular world. David works zooms more closely than I have done into the meso level of state institutions, bureaucracies, and state-religion relations, to explain in greater detail why and how we have seen the kinds of bureaucratic and policy changes taking place under the first Trump administration. Here, his comparative training and institutionalist approach, compared to my own disciplinary orientation in international relations, really shine bright. Now, I cannot sit here and only lavish praise on David's book. Let me therefore turn to critique. In truth, I mostly want to put forward some thoughts which do not really point to any major shortcomings or flaws in David's scholarship, but are mostly a series of comments intended to stimulate further reflection and discussion. For the sake of time, I'll limit my remarks to two main points, although I would have probably have a third one to raise as well, but I saw that Christina Stöckel sort of highlights some of these in her own comments. Now, first, the role of populism. David has already heard my comments here, but I thought I have engaged with his book and so far, but I thought of putting them forward once more, since I suspect others will have similar observations, thus giving David a chance to respond openly and sort of publicly. While reading the book, I wondered about the extent to which it is actually populism, the driving force of the changes that David observes, or whether instead other ideological and social forces matter too, if not more. Chiefly, I have in mind here what in the past was referred to as the Christian right or the religious right, and today increasingly is labeled as Christian nationalism. The kinds of identity politics and traditional values agenda that David finds the Trump administration pursuing seems to me that they can be explained as well by pointing to conservative religious forces, or what Rogers Brubaker has also called Christianism and civilizationism, rather than populism in American politics. Looking ahead to the second Trump presidency, I furthermore believe that the kind of forces sustaining him are more complex than the label and notion of populism would suggest. On the one hand, we have seen a further deepening of the religious dimension of Donald Trump as a political and sacred symbol. He appears increasingly as a messiah-like figure, particularly in the wake of the failed assassination attempts. There has been a messianization and sacralization of Trump, who also represents a particular form of charismatic, both in religious but also in Weberian terms, forms of authority and leadership. On the other hand, from a more secular and profane perspective, the Trump phenomenon seems to go beyond populism, with a proliferating number of terms deployed to try to capture and make sense of and legitimize, in some cases, this phenomenon, including through labels such as far right, extreme right, racism, white supremacism, plutocracy, oligarchy, authoritarianism, and fascism, and so on. In other words, can we still think of Trump as simply a populist? And if this concept is limiting, what kind of forces will likely shape and influence his administration's foreign policy when it comes to religion in the new administration? Second point, the book meticulously explores the causes and manifestations of changes in American foreign policy institutions, rhetoric, and practices under Trump. What I was curious to know more about were also the global outcomes and effects of these religious foreign policies themselves. In fairness, the lack of attention to these issues is not just a limit of this book alone. It is widespread in the literature, including my own work, in fact. David does pay some attention to foreign policy outcomes. For example, he explores the international alliances around conservative religious agenda that the Trump administrations and figures close to him formed with religious traditionalists in Russia, Hindu nationalists in India, Viktor Orban's Hungary, and Jair Bolsonaro's Brazil, which he explores in Chapter 8, Faithful Partners, which he mentioned in his talk now as well. Having said this, I think that the next step in this kind of research on the entanglements between religion and states' foreign policy is to unpack and probe further the effects they are having across different societies, religious communities, and regions of the world. Now, to conclude, overall, I believe David's books constitutes a really important empirical, theoretical, and methodological contribution to the scholarship seeking to make sense of the complex relationship between religion, populism, and American foreign policy, which is more relevant than ever given the incoming second Trump presidency. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gregorio. So now I will take the floor first to convey the questions, or rather remark from Christina Stöckel, who could not unfortunately join us. So she had a few points that she wanted to share with you, David, and us. So the first one is on timeline. At one point, you write in the conclusion that the greatest single legacy of the Trump administration in religion and foreign policy turned out to be that it brought domestic polarization over religion into foreign policy bureaucracy. And she pushed back on that, saying, I would have suspected that this is not Trump's legacy, that it happened also already before from the 90s onward. So if you want to address that. The second question from her is from a study of the American Christian Right organization, creating links with Russia. She gathered the understanding that to a certain extent, for this groups going to Russia was a choice they made because they felt that domestically they had lost the culture war. So she wanted apparently that you unfold a little more or develop a little more this connection with Russia that is anterior to the Trump administration. And the third question, actually, no, it's not a question, it's more of a remark. So I leave it at that. So now I take my own hat on. And I want to first express my appreciation for the depth and rigor of the book and the work you offer in this book. This is a very important and timely contribution to understand really this intersection of religion, populism, and foreign policy. And I think it's, in my opinion, one of the first trying to combine these at least two major threads of scholarship, religion and populism, and religion and foreign policy on the other hand. And the book is very engaged in revisiting the major theories of populism, and you do something that very few people do, because in the populist literature, you have people who look, as you say, to thin ideology, you have people who look at strategy, mud on one side and Weyland on the other side, but none really brings this together. I mean, they look at through one lens, and you are bringing these lenses together. And I want to commend that because it's not an easy thing to do. And it's quite positive and relevant, and it brings something new to the literature, religion, and populism. I think also it's one of the first books that really systematically look at religious populism from within the institutions. Which is also something interesting. You have work on populist leader in state position or ruling position, but religious populist and the state is something that is much less systematically studied. One also point that I really appreciated is that you try to avoid as much as possible fixed, rigid approaches to either religion or politics. And as you know, this has been one of my major, not that I'm saying you are following my path, that's not what I say. I want to say that it's very rewarding to me to see that more and more scholarship is not starting with a fixed definition of religion, like it used to be 15 years ago. And it's very interesting to see how some of the meaning that we would attribute to religion move to politics and vice versa, and the fluidity of that, which also goes with, a rich literature on overcoming the rigid boundaries between not only religion and politics, but also secular and religious. And third, a very great point for me in the book is your meticulous engagement with policy documents, speeches, case studies. You give a very granular approach to indeed the policy in the making and the tension that go with that. And for that, I enjoyed reading it just for that. And it's, as you said in the beginning, it's not a memoir, but it has a lively tone sometimes of lived experience. So I want to raise 3 points that are, I want to say it clearly, these are not critique, but more points for further discussion, okay? The first one that really, it really went, it was in front of my mind each time I was reading on your analysis of Trump bypassing the institution. And that's true, but it is not my, I'm not contesting that, but because I did a work comparing the religious populism institution of Trump, Erdogan, and Putin. It's clear that the institution, the foreign policy aspect of Trump populism is very small compared to the one of someone like Putin or someone like Erdogan. And one of the reasons is because there is some institutional constraints. And you show this too, meaning he is, despite all his style and the buoyancy, he is also limited by the institutions. And so his politics remained, and that's also the point that Christine made and Gregorio made, he remains pretty much limited into what I would call, to use another scholar of populism, sedimented practices of what is the role of religion in American foreign policy, which is basically religious freedom agenda, which was created by Clinton, 1998. So you know how much of this can it change? And the whole push of evangelical movement towards the Middle East and especially Israel, the move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in terms of embassy was driven by the demand of the evangelical. He said it clearly. So, but this is still, you know, this is still the bastion of the foreign policy engagement with religion, despite the Trump style, I would say. So there are limits there that I would like you to discuss a little more. And at the same time, the continuity of a certain way of engaging religion in foreign policy that starts before Trump. The other point I wanted to make, and I will stop that, is about the fact that religious populism has always been looked, and that's why I like the book very much, usually from the grassroots level, the mobilization of people, especially in America, where we have now a huge literature on why do evangelical, you know, mobilize in politics. But at the same time, in your book, this is not even touched on. I understand you cannot do everything, and I get that. But how does this connect? It looks like we have an institutional game, quote unquote, but where does it connect with the grounded, you know, reality of religious populism for Trump, you know? So I just mentioned this evangelical link between the push of evangelical toward, you know, a global claim beyond American or Christian nationalism, and how could you have done this a little more systematically in the sense of this strategy or institutional strategy of the Trump administration? And I will stop that because you have to respond to all of us.
Well, I also want to give plenty of time for questions. So what I'll probably do, these are great. Thank you both so much. And again, thanks to Christina in her absence for her thoughts. Maybe in the interest of time, I will give one response to each, and then we can have time for questions too. You know, Gregorio, I think that your point about kind of what does populism bring to the analysis that a focus on something like Christian nationalism or one of these other ideological forces wouldn't is well taken. My answer to that is that is actually twofold. First of all, the a focus only on Christian nationalism or some kind of religious nationalism variable wouldn't explain why certain parts of the bureaucracy were treated differently. In other words, why wasn't the Office of Religion and Global Affairs sort of staffed with devoted Christian nationalists to try to push this kind of forward, right? I think that it's the personalism that you need to make sense of that kind of changes in process, not substance, right? And I really do think that the process changes related to Trumpism and foreign policy are important to make sense of, and maybe even more dramatically different than the substantive changes. And so I think that that's one of the main things I think that the populism term brings to the table, and helps us to integrate into the analysis. I do think Christian on the ideological side of the story, as you know, I think Christian nationalism is important, right? I think sometimes we might actually risk, though, if we focus only on kind of ideology as kind of a bounding, placing a constraint on Trump, basically. One of the nice things about the populism literature is that this thin ideology's thinness means that it's not particularly binding, actually, that Trump can, sure, host international religious freedom convocations when it's helpful for him, but hey, he can actually also choose to ignore the recommendation to designate India as a country of particular concern because he has kind of a personal vibe with Modi and ignores the kind of Christian nationalist angle when it comes there, right? So, you know, that's essentially my response on that point. But I do think that we obviously still do need to pay attention to the other dimensions. You know, your Messiah-like dynamics point is very interesting, right? I mean, to me, that actually blends the ideology side of it with the personalism, because of course a Messiah is, well, I don't know how a Messiah would govern. I assume it would be personalistically. I don't know. But yeah, the person, right, that Trump has taken on, the personal role that Trump takes on is rooted in kind of almost, the personalism is religious too, right? And I think that's an interesting angle to the argument that I don't develop as much, but could be played out more. The way that religious actors give their, I do discuss this to an extent, give their blessing to the personalistic politics, right? I think that is worth attention to. On Christina's comments, I mean, many really interesting ones. On the timing of polarization, I think she's obviously right that there has always been culture wars dynamics within foreign policy, right? So you go back, as she mentions in her comment, you go back to the UN conferences in the mid-90s about gender, right? And probably even farther than that. So that wasn't new. I do think, though, that there was a general agreement, and this is where Gregorio's work comes into play, actually, between at least many conservatives and many Republicans and many Democrats on this kind of bureaucratized approach to religion in the foreign policy process, even if they disagreed on the goals that bureaucracy should pursue, right? So, you know, we see the George W. Bush administration going through a very bureaucratically rationalistic process to put PEPFAR into place and to implement PEPFAR, right? It's not an anti-institutional program. It's one that's highly institutionalized. That grows in a relatively consistent way across administrations. Even if the goals sometimes change from administration to administration, there's a general agreement that the process should be to increase the bureaucratic capacity of the U.S. government to think about religious issues. What Beth Hurd talks about is expert religion, right? This kind of idea that there is an expert religion that would bring something to this. That's what I think is relatively consistent, actually, going back to the 90s and early 2000s. And that's what has changed. That's a big part of what has changed, I think, in the Trump era. And again, I see that step away from bureaucratization and towards personalism is really closely tied to the populist nature of things. You know, on Jocelyn's comments, I mean, really, super interesting too. I think that the question about is there actually a smaller effect here from kind of religion and populism than in cases like Turkey or cases like Russia because the bureaucracy is stronger? I think there is some truth to that. You know, I think that for instance, we have not seen in the U.S. Well, we'll see what happens now. But in the first Trump term, we never saw the kind of confrontation with the bureaucracy that happens in Turkey after the coup attempt, right? Where we really see a comprehensive kind of effort to take over the bureaucracy and eliminate its ability to constrain. And so I think there's some truth to that. In the book, I talk a fair amount about, and maybe this is one source of optimism in the book, the ways in which populism really doesn't care about a lot of foreign policy issues, right? It's just not particularly important. And that creates opportunities for what I call persistence within the bureaucracy that's not confrontational, right? It's not about directly confronting the populists' strategies, but it's about huge swaths of diplomacy that just aren't all that relevant to the populist because they're not necessary for his domestic political needs. And so in those areas, yeah, the career staff can continue to push some of these initiatives forward, right? We saw, I think, some of that happen for a while, at least in RGA while I was working there. I talk a little bit about that in the book. And I think like USAID, some of that happened, right, where there was some attempts to focus on the stuff that's not going to get the White House's attention, basically, right? And so I think you may be right, actually, that in some ways, some of these effects may be more mild because of the bureaucracy is stronger in the U.S. context than it would be in Turkey or in Russia at this point in time. Yeah. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks all so much, and very happy to have conversation in the 10 or so minutes that we have left with anyone in the audience.
So audience, the floor is yours. Again, you can raise your hand or you can write Q&A. I do not see Q&A.
Well, that's fine. And if people, I can also continue to respond to, I can go back to you all's earlier points too, while people are typing in their questions if they have any.
Yes.
Yeah, your question about mobilization, Jocelyn, was very perceptive, right? We do normally, I think that's right, that scholars of religion and populism are normally focused on the mobilizational part of the story. So religion is a way that populists can draw boundaries and mobilize people. So how does foreign policy fit into that? You know, I think that to an extent, we can see that in some of the policy issues that were selected, right? So for instance, the Jerusalem embassy decision, right? I think that is essentially a mobilizational decision, right? That's and probably has some effect, right, in sort of shoring up his support in public opinion. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to have a public opinion kind of part of the book was because I think it's important to show that his as much as we can in survey data, that some of Trump's substantive policy goals really do resonate with religious conservatives in unique ways, and so that there's reason to think that played some mobilizational part. You know, I think that the other piece of foreign policy that was in some ways linked to mobilization was the sort of style, and this isn't something that I analyze a lot in the book, but there's some sections on it. The way in which the typical religion and diplomacy event during the Obama administration or Kerry White House was a relatively private meeting that was advertised to a few experts in the foreign policy community and in the religious community. Splashy events were not the center of most of that work, right? We really did see this change, especially with international religious freedom, to these large ministerials and this desire to have kind of the biggest convenings ever in the State Department, right? That kind of rhetoric. And it's not like these were mass rallies. You weren't having 10,000 people in the building for a populist rally, but the style there was more reminiscent of a kind of populist mobilizational approach. And of course, also when you're bringing more and more people together, that is potentially then having trickle-down effects to the folks who are connected to those people. Yeah, so there would be more work to be done on that for sure. But the links between the substance of foreign policy and the style of foreign policy during the administration and its mobilizational side, I think are interesting to think about. So thanks for putting that on the table. Okay, so that was a few minutes. Are there any questions that I can jump to for now, or no? I'll go back to Gregorio's point.
There is one in the chat, actually.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't see it. Let me click over.
From Vinicius. Hello, Vinicius.
Oh, good question.
How do you see the connection between Christian nationalism and white nationalism in foreign policy?
So this is, I'm a little disappointed that this came up, because I think this may be the biggest weakness in the book. Race is not central to my analysis in the book. It's just not. And I think that in retrospect, that was maybe a missed opportunity. I mean, because I do obviously this link between kind of religious hierarchy and racial hierarchy is very robust in public opinion data, for instance, right? And we have lots of interesting scholarship on this. And also that Christian nationalism functions differently in white communities in the United States than it does in other communities, right? So yeah, the honest truth is that it's not a major theme in the book. Now, can I think of how it would arise? It's an interesting question. I mean, I do think of all the literature that exists on kind of race and foreign policy and U.S. foreign policy and hierarchy, right, in different ways. I'm thinking of potentially the ways in which, for instance, countries were selected to have those so-called Muslim bans applied to them, right? It wasn't all Muslim majority countries that were subject to visa bans, right? It was only certain ones. And I'm sure that there would be a way to analyze that process as being tied not only to kind of objective security threat, but also not just to religion, because they obviously were Muslim majority at first, but also to racial dynamics in that. But that's not a primary focus of the argument as it is for right now. So, for the next article, right, I think that's a useful topic to take up, is how race and religion reinforce each other in this foreign policy. Yeah, great question.
I would like to give you the opportunity to maybe extrapolate now that we have another Trump administration.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think from what you have researched that can happen? Because also if we look at the condition of his election and who voted for him this time, it's a slightly different configuration than in the first election. So again, if we want to connect between, what's happening on the ground and these policies, what do you think could happen?
Well, one area that I would definitely point to is, so one of the demographics where Trump improved most was among Hispanic Latino communities, right? I've seen a lot of scholarship already looking at how that's tied to educational divides within those communities in the United States. I think that's probably true, but it's also deeply tied to religious divides within those communities, and especially strength of Trumpism among evangelically oriented Hispanics and Latinos in this country, right? It's not in this book, but I have looked at that data, and it's very robust that that his support is strongest among evangelical identifiers in Hispanic and Latino communities in this country. And we've seen this even then in the ties between, and some of this is in the book, the ties between people around Bolsonaro, for instance, in Brazil, and the kind of evangelical side of Bolsonaro's support, and Trump's advisors here in this country, like Steve Bannon, who've been involved in some of this religious kind of rhetoric. So I would expect, for instance, to see continued foreign policy attention to the priorities of Hispanic and Latino evangelicals in kind of social conservative kind of religious nationalist politics in Central and South America. And I think that's definitely worth tracking. That could include Venezuela policy, obviously. Obviously, I mean, always Cuba policy for those communities. But yeah, I think that would be really worth tracking. In terms of process, that's more about the substance moving forward. I think keeping an eye on the Western Hemisphere, and it would be worth doing. In terms of process, I think that there are two potential, I'm not sure, I think I see two potential outcomes, right? And people have asked me a lot about this since the election. One outcome is kind of Project 2025 lays the groundwork for a really aggressive confrontation with the bureaucracy this time. That basically the first time around, a lot of the bureaucracy was simply bypassed, in part because Trump wasn't ready to govern, because they weren't expecting to win. Their political appointees were maybe not as ideologically coherent in the first term, and so they didn't even trust each other. And so they really couldn't actually confront the whole bureaucracy, which is why I see some of the kind of persistence things that I see in the first term. But the next time around, potentially, you'll have a more ideologically coherent dedication to confronting the bureaucracy and really replacing anyone who's kind of not on board in a more comprehensive way. That's possible. I do think that, and so having, for instance, a much more fully staffed out White House office on faith-based affairs from the beginning, where there's a real effort to work through the bureaucracy to push things through, right, in a comprehensive way by having loyalists in positions. I don't know, though, if that's the most likely outcome, because I tend to think that, again, the personalism will essentially always make a populist ruler likely to, it's costly to change the whole bureaucracy. It takes confrontation with legal constraints, right? It's gonna present obstacles to the administration's focus and attention. And so I think it's equally possible that actually we don't see a real comprehensive replacement of existing bureaucracy, but that, again, we just see things kind of bypassed and run through personal ties to the White House and kind of symbolic initiatives that don't actually see much, that don't look much different than they looked the first time around, mostly because the populist leader is just not interested in the hard work of kind of replacing bureaucracies, right? I mean, and I'm not sure, honestly. I could see either of those options playing out. And the other question is, of course, how term limits and the nature of the future and the time horizons of the populist play into this. Trump doesn't have to get reelected again, right? And maybe that changes some of his calculations. But it's a good question, and one that will bear future analysis.
So you have your work cut out for you.
Well, everybody else does too, yeah.
But thank you. This was really, really lively and interesting, and again, congratulations on the new book. And
yeah, well, thank you, Jocelyn, and to everyone who came. I hope it was interesting. Happy to have further conversation. Anyone who's in the audience, feel free to reach out. And Jocelyn and Gregorio, thanks again so much for giving up your time at what I know is a busy time in everyone's calendar. So thanks.
It was my pleasure, and thank you for joining us, and see you the next session in January. We have a session coming up on the Pope and the foreign policy. So thank you, and happy holidays, because the end of the year is approaching, and see you on this format or another. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Congratulations,
Bye, everybody.
David. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, everyone. Yeah. See you all soon.